Morning, everyone. Just a note of information, Harvey Sickerman, who normally is here and running the show as president of FPRI, is ill, and he was ill the last time, too. I hope he's doing better.
He is.
And my name is David Bockel. I'm the executive director here at the Reserve Officers Association. Last time we met, we were upstairs on the 5th floor. We were a little bit more intimate today, and the heat is coming on, by the way, if any of you all are freezing to death. This morning, the first panel, I'm going to introduce the first panel to you, China's Rise, Chinese Strategy, and Regional Security. The commentator who is going to control it is Mackubin over here on your right in place of Dr. Sickerman. The members of the panel this morning, Gilbert Rozman, Princeton University, the Wilson Center, wrote a paper called Chinese Strategic Thinking on Multilateral Regional Security, and that's what's going to be discussed. Jacques, help me pronounce it. deLisle? Hey, that's not too bad. Bonnie Glaser, and Gilbert, I hope I have your name down here somewhere. I don't. Gilbert Rozman is the third panelist, and Mac Owens the commentator. Hope you enjoy your stay here today. Hope the heat comes on. Hope the food is good, and I know you're going to get a lot out of the seminar today. So, Mac, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. As you can see, my role is a little expanded from what was originally the intent. Because of Harvey's illness. He is doing better, we guess, and hopefully he'll be out of the hospital pretty soon. Now, one of the things you're going to miss is that Harvey's a very elegant speaker, and I'm not, but I am economical, so I will just say a couple of things here, basically to thank the Reserve Officer Association for the association that we have. We've been doing these things for quite a while. ROA, of course, is a very strong voice for American national security. Just a couple of things about FPRI. Our focus is basically bringing the insights of scholarship to the questions of national security. We've been doing that now for about 55 years. I would like to thank Jacques deLisle because he set this panel up. He is one of our experts there at FPRI and has been very instrumental in putting these together. The last issue of Orbis, which I edit, had papers from an earlier conference that we had. The conference is being webcast. Alan Luxembourg, who is our vice president, sitting over there, and as a matter of fact, when we get to the question and answer period, he will be we'll be taking questions from our web audience as well. And just as far as the panel, Gilbert will be giving the paper. And Bonnie and Jacques will be providing commentary. And what I'd like to do is ask that the paper presentation be limited to 15 minutes, and that each of the commentators be limited to 10 minutes each. I'll try to maintain the discipline of time. It's always interesting, of course, to try to do that, but we'll see if in fact it can happen. So we want to leave as much time as possible for questions. So that's our purpose here in trying to control the time for the presentations. As I say, the general will introduce the panelists, so I will just turn it right over to Gilbert. Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here at this meeting on regional security in Northeast Asia. I'm particularly pleased that the timing allows for, I think, a fuller perception of the state of China's thinking about regional security, and it's my opportunity to try to assess that. I'll start with three principal generalizations that I want to make in my remarks. The first is that there are three, I think, prevailing explanations for why China's behavior has become more egregious and its rhetoric as well, especially in the last 6 months, but visibly in the last couple of years. One explanation is it's rooted in some kind of energy, sea lanes, economic thinking as China is trying to gain more security in these dimensions. And after all, these disputes focus on maritime issues, and that's where those themes are pronounced. A second explanation is it's rooted in hard power as China anticipates military power that is more likely to counter U.S. power in the region. And therefore, as its military might increases, it is taking a more assertive position. The third explanation centers more on a deep-seated thinking, and I would say that relates to a national identity, and it could be called sinocentrism, and can be reflected in rhetoric and how rhetoric influences behavior. I'm going to draw on all of these explanations, but the one I will put emphasis on and argue is primary is the sinocentric thinking in China. And I've tried to trace it in recent writings back 3 decades and argue that it is not some abrupt change in the last couple of years, but it's been building for a long time as conditions make it easier to bring it into the open. The second generalization I make is that China's approach towards multilateralism, which it has ostensibly championed in recent years and argued it is the true backer of, in contrast to the United States, especially in the Bush years of unilateralism, that approach is in fact mostly a facade. It is not serious about multilateralism. It has supported limited multilateralism for specific aims that serve to manage a great power relationship and steer a particular sub-region of Asia in a direction favorable to China's agenda. The third generalization I will make is that as we move towards reorganization in Asia, we've had a lot of talk shops, we've had a lot of organizational startups, but now we're moving towards, I think, the crunch time where several organizations are being tested, and China can determine whether these will become serious organizations or whether they will be rather empty. As we move to this point, China's approach right now is not to strengthen these organizations, and I will talk about all 3 of these and how they are really going to test China in the coming years. The first organization is the Six-Party Talks, which I've argued in the past is the really important international multilateral venue for understanding great power relations and the potential for transformation in those relations. The second is the trilateralism between China, Japan, and South Korea, which I regard as more important than ASEAN plus 3. It is a real test of how these 3 major states, outside of ASEAN's guidance, are able to or unable to build a stronger sense of cooperation, including the East Asian community, which is an objective of both the ASEAN plus 3 and the trilateralism. And third, I will point to the new East Asian Summit, which just, I gather today or yesterday, was officially transformed into the ASEAN plus 8 with the decision to admit the United States and Russia. And this organization has great significance because it brings together the leaders and the powers that could really bring about a transformation in Asia, a real reorganization, if the various countries involved led it. And so far, I think China is the country most unlikely to accept its expanded functions, because China has has objected in the past to the development of the East Asian Summit when it was a smaller unit, ASEAN plus 6, and insisted that ASEAN plus 3 is the only proper venue for the main agenda that is discussed. I'll say a little bit about sinocentrism because it figures a lot into my interpretation. I think it is a view that does, of course, put China in the center and emphasize how the subregions of Asia really are China plus a group of countries. But beyond that, it emphasizes the role of history. It offers a historical depth to understanding the transformation of Asia. It has a very strong moral component about the proper role of respect, deference, going back to China's historical tributary system. It is a kind of vision of regional order, and it stands out as opposed to universal values and, of course, U.S. hegemonism or U.S. centrism. It is related to delegitimizing the United States. And it has a good deal of overlap with a communist worldview. It's not as if it's just Chinese history before the emergence of communism. It's really a mixture of the worldview that was achieved under Mao with some modifications and the historical sinocentrist perspective. I can also say, based on my comparisons with Russia, the Soviet Union, that there's a lot of similarity between the rhetoric in China about what is happening in Asia and the rhetoric under Brezhnev 30 years ago about the United States is the cause of the breakup of the status quo. It was post-détente, how the Soviet Union broke up détente and interrupted Jimmy Carter's idealist multilateral approach by saying it was all the United States' fault. It was assertive, it was unilateral, and the Soviet Union had to counter it. And it alienated just about everybody in Asia except North Korea and Vietnam. And now we've got China alienating a lot of countries in Asia and a similar kind of demonizing view of the United States. I'm not saying that there isn't a lot of difference here in the, especially the economic approach. But if you look at China's rhetoric carefully, this is what I see. And I'll give 3 examples of that rhetoric. The Xi Jinping, the heir to Hu Jintao, statement about the Korean War, that just the other day saying it was a defensive, justified war. That is a historical vindication for China that contradicts much of what we've been hearing from Chinese moderates, how they were moving away from that interpretation. And it links history, the delegitimizes the U.S. role on the Korean Peninsula, and suggests a different approach to the regional order and the six-party talks. Or the Chinese refusal the other day to meet with the Japanese prime minister, and the way they treated the fisheries, the fishing captain arrest as linked to Japanese history, making Japanese revisionism and realism the same thing, and arguing that Japan doesn't have a just position to a moral justification for leadership in the region, but in the meantime, a much more assertive approach after a few years of thaw and improvement with a cultural linkage too, with relations with Japan. Or the treatment of the Nobel Prize winner, Liu Xiaobo, and his blaming him and the way the Nobel Prize was given on a Western strategy to undermine China for regime change in China, and many of the writings have even suggested it's a parallel to the effort which succeeded to destroy the Soviet Union. So all of these are placed in long-term historical comparative perspective and don't give any sense of what the other side thinks, but really demonize the other side. So I'll say a few things about each of my 3 reorganization issues in the remainder of my remarks. The first issue is the great six-party talks. I think they really were a vital test of Sino-U.S. relations, far more than of North Korea. I don't think many people ever expected North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons, including the U.S. government and the negotiators. They had to put a positive face on it, but I think it was all about China and the United States. Would China and the United States work out a deal so that we would soften, as China insisted and had insisted ever since the early 90s nuclear crisis, and they would harden, as they apparently did in 2006, getting us to move forward on our February agreement of 2007. And so there was about 18 months of optimism about Sino-U.S. cooperation in dealing with North Korea. And then the North Koreans backed out on a pretext, not because there was a really substantive difference. If they'd wanted to go forward with those talks, there was plenty of opportunity to do so, particularly with Obama coming in and looking towards an effort to manage this situation in a multilateral fashion, pragmatic fashion. And what is surprising and disappointing in these last almost 2 years is the Chinese response at each stage. I mean, they may have agreed to some sanctions. They may have initially blamed North Korea to a degree. But essentially, they've been blaming the United States and North Korea roughly equally in recent times. And the Chonan sinking showed some true colors, I'm afraid. And then we've got the way they've treated North Korea in the last 3 or 4 weeks with the 65th anniversary of the celebration in Pyongyang, and the way China has repeatedly during this time reinterpreted its relationship with North Korea in a positive way. Said a lot of things, not just about the war, that suggests that it has a different approach. China wants to restart the six-party talks, but it wants to do so with a different agenda. For the last period, from 2003 on, it was the United States that was pushing the agenda and they had a plan for these talks. Now it's China that wants to do so. But its agenda, emphasizing moving towards a peace regime and overlapping heavily with North Korea's agenda, is not a very appealing agenda for the United States. It marginalizes South Korea. Japan and Russia have been marginalized in the past, and so it essentially says the United States, the triangle, China, United States, and North Korea will go forward. You negotiate with North Korea over a peace regime as the primary players, and we will be supportive of that agenda within the six-party talks. It is not a path forward. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be compromise in the process and that we won't get these talks going. I still think they are vital for regional security. They are the core of multilateralism in Northeast Asia. But for the moment, at least, we have to say that China's approach is not towards multilateralism. It's toward marginalizing South Korea, gaining leverage over North Korea, both to reshape regional security by limiting the alliance system and weakening the U.S. position, and to reshape the process of reunification in the Korean Peninsula, helping North Korea gain a stronger hand. And denuclearization is there, but it clearly is secondary and at a later stage after other things are done that serve other purposes. So this I call not very helpful multilateralism. The second issue, trilateralism, and I will be very brief. It seems to me that China, Japan, and Korea are ready to set up a secretariat next year in Seoul. They've had a lot of discussion about how to advance a free trade agreement among all three countries and other economic objectives. But now China sees Japan and South Korea in a more negative light. It had leaders in both countries who were inclined to give China the benefit of the doubt and were eager to build up some sort of East Asian community. No Mu-hin in Korea to 2008, and Hatoyama Yukio in 2009, 2010, both went to China and essentially said, we want to have better relations with you, let's get going. And what now has happened in both countries, and I don't think it's primarily because of leadership change, I think it's because China saw that it wasn't getting nearly enough from these countries. And, of course, No's departure in favor of Lee Myung-bak created a situation in South Korea where China felt they weren't getting deference. There was a re-strengthening the alliance, and it has had a a very negative approach, pressure-filled approach towards South Korea ever since. And I think with Japan, you could see the handwriting on the wall long before Hatoyama left, how China had turned much more negative towards Japan. It was building up its alliance with the U.S. It's not working in favor of Sinocentrism. They gave up on Japan, is what I'd say. And so I don't see any prospect for this trilateralism moving except towards a free trade agreement if Japan and South Korea are trusting of the Chinese economy, and that right now I think Japan is very unlikely to be so, even though there's so much economic integration advancing. Finally, on the last point, the East Asian Summit. This is where I think the action must be. It brings together India, Russia, the other powers, the middle powers, Indonesia, Australia, and others. It's got real potential. It may be a little large at 18, but I think there's a general sense that the major countries, the major powers, will be shaping the agenda, even though ASEAN ostensibly is in the forefront. And so the question is, what does China want from this? Is it willing to allow the security agenda in here to expand, for instance, to talk about North Korea, which is not a member? So far, there's no indication that China wants to talk about North Korea unless North Korea is there and it's trying to balance North and South. Is the East Asian Summit going to be able to become the core organization to try to get at some of the basic, especially non-economic issues in Asian reorganization? And so just as the test previously was the six-party talks, I think we've got a new test. And right now, I don't see any sign that the Chinese debate about this summit is suggesting it's taking this organization very seriously. So right now, I conclude by saying China is very reluctant to go forward with multilateralism. It sees itself as isolated. It's really isolated itself, but it still has an enormous number of levers. It's the kind of single country with considerable power that can still shape much of the agenda, and I don't think we've seen the last word in this effort to try to balance multilateralism and Sinocentrism, although for the moment Sinocentrism clearly has the edge.
Thank you very much. Jacques, ask you to go.
Sure. Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. I'm fresh off the plane from China, so if I zone out in the middle of this, please forgive me. This paper is vintage Gil Rozman. It's immersed in the details, the twists and turns of foreign policy within the region, and it has Gil's rare ability to come at it from all three sides, China, Japan, and Korea. Secondly, it's vintage Gil, and it articulates a conceptual framework to make sense of this messy reality. It's a trinity of trinities, I think. Three countries, China, Japan, Korea. Three regional institutional structures, the six-party talks, the trilateralist Japan, China, South Korea arrangement, and the East Asia Summit. And there are three possible explanations for the patterns Gil discerns: resources, hard power, and history. I want to partly recast and supplement the paper a bit in terms of the theoretical explanations he has, and then offer a couple of additional comments. First, in terms of resources, this plays a relatively modest role, but set in context, I think it matters more. That is, we're talking here not just about material resources at issue in the disputed territories, but more broadly China's quest in these regions and beyond for the things that will sustain the remarkable economic growth that China has had and that has underpinned its rise in power, and on which its internal legitimacy and stability arguably depend. So the six-party talks, as Gil says, some modest issue of access to natural resources in North Korea, but one can add the significant resource question of what would happen if North Korea collapsed. That's a significant hit to China economically. Trilaterally, it's partly about the resources in the disputed East China Sea zones, but you can add the economic gains to be reaped from the FTA approach that Gil says rightly is now at the center of trilateralism, and an attempt more broadly to bind the two neighbors ever more closely to China economically, with all of the implications that may have for political and security relations, a kind of Taiwan strategy toward the region, if you will. Although, of course, this approach also leads to security hedging. As one gets more dependent, we've seen signs of regional states tightening their ties to the U.S. and the U.S. welcoming that. In the East Asia Summit context as well, there are resource issues. Of course, the perennially contested, although of uncertain magnitude, resources in the South China Sea. But here again, you can add the broader economic context in which that conflict or that tension unfolds. That is the ASEAN-China free trade area and other Chinese agendas to deepen economic ties with the region, which many analysts, I think, quite plausibly see as driven as much by Chinese politics as by Chinese economics. That is the desire to gain economic leverage and the desire to reduce the fear level or the anxiety level about China as an economic competitor rather than a partner for regional states. In terms of the hard power story, this I think actually, here I differ with Gil's interpretation of his own paper. I think this does as much work as the history and Sinocentrism part does, but maybe I'm just being cynical. China is essentially engaged in conventional hard power tactics, it seems to me, in the account Gil offers and in what would be a fair-minded account in any event, engaging and dealing with the multilateral fora here in ways that protect China's security interests, make use of its growing hard power resources, and serve to maximize the advantages that it can derive from its increasing stature and status. I think the old line about NATO during the great multilateral security institution of Europe in the Cold War days, the line was that it was meant to keep the Germans down, the U.S. in, and the Russians out. And there's an analogy in Rozman's paper here to what's going on with China in the region today. The trilateral structure seems to be emerging in China's view as a way of keeping Japan-Korea, with the U.S. in the background, down, to avoid too much ganging up, as it were, on China, keep it focused narrowly on economic issues and avoid the security implications that might come from a U.S. Japan-Korea reinforcement of ties. In terms of the East Asia Summit, it's an attempt to keep the way China approaches it is increasingly an attempt to keep the U.S. and perhaps other extra-regional powers out, or at least out as much as possible, so that it remains an ability to keep this from becoming a core multilateral institution that could reshape things in the way that Gil points to. China's, of course, not been entirely successful in this. It's approached various ASEAN Plus arrangements, the notional East Asia community of a while ago, and the recent U.S. assertion of a role in addressing South China Sea disputes in an area that China considers its Hexinli, its core interest, as a pushback. But I think China is pushing back in its own directions. Finally, the six-party talks are an attempt to keep North Korea in. That is, at the very least, to keep it in existence as a functioning separate regime, but also to retain a certain degree of viability and insulation from what are bad deals for North Korea. And there you see China, defending North Korean interests, as it were, and legitimacy even. In this story, to be sure, we have less clarity, force, and drama than in the NATO-Warsaw Pact structure, but as in all interregional comparisons of institutional structures, Europe looks a bit more robust than East Asia. Next to the history question. Here I think it is a history question, and it's not quite Sinocentrism. It's close, but I think there's another piece to it, too. And here I would say that the obvious resonances are there, but it really is China's wounded history rather than China's proud history as being at the center of its region. So if you look at the six-party talks in the Korean Peninsula, these are redolent of Korea's former status as a vassal state of the central country. China insists on a central role in the six-party talks. Its preference is to have itself be the key player in determining the fate of the peninsula, all like it was supposed to be in the good old days, but hasn't been in the time since. The trilateralism story, the Korean part of it is pretty much the same. The Japan part, of course, evokes quite explicitly now the wounds of Japanese imperial depredations as China sees it from the 19th and 20th centuries, the product in the East China Sea context of the failure to fulfill the promises of Potsdam and Cairo, and so on. In the East Asian community, East Asian Summit issue, where a lot of it is Southeast Asia centered, here too we're talking about a region of traditional Chinese imperial influence, a set of irredentist territorial claims rooted in historic seas and arguments about unequal treaties imposed by Europeans on a traitorous and coerced Qing dynasty. And of course the U.S. presence in the region chafes as well as an outside power traipsing on Chinese core interests. So pretty close, but I think a slightly different take. The third feature of this, which is also vintage Gil, is the important takeaway. There's a nice little soundbite takeaway from it, which is we're shifting from an era of economics in command to an era of security in command, as it were, in the region, and that multilateralism is suffering as a consequence of the shift in emphases. At least the Chinese support for it has waned. In my remaining couple of minutes, I want to take a step back from complimenting with an I and complimenting with an E what Gil said and raise a couple of further questions. First, I want to press a little bit on what the bottom line here is on China's engagement with regional multilateralism and the relatively weak institutions of multilateralism in East Asia, particularly in security areas. It's possible to tell a story that says China is genuinely ambivalent about such engagement, right? Multilateralism chafes against Sino-centric world orders. It lacks a certain appeal to a regional fast-rising power that is wary of being constrained by those structures. On the other hand, anti-unilateralism, at least, if not full multilateralism, is a deep trope of Chinese foreign policy. And there are limits to hypocrisy even in foreign policy, so it's not lightly abandoned. And it does, or at least it can be the case, that some multilateral structures have served and could serve China's interests, particularly in assuaging fears of regional states through engagement in various multilateral processes. Another possible theory is that China's commitment to multilateralism was always a complete sham, that China is and always has been the arch practitioner of realpolitik, and all that multilateralism was a step in Taoguangyanghui. Hide your brightness and develop your strength. And it will be discarded, as it is being now, as China gains in confidence and power. Or another take that says China's commitment to multilateralism is real, but it's narrowly instrumental. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. All the instability we see is due to calculations about where exactly, where in the relatively near term, the relatively narrow context, a particular multilateral structure helps or doesn't help China's interests. Or a slightly overlapping point, maybe we're looking at an N curve of multilateralism in China's approach to the outside world and the region. It starts low when a relatively weak and newly open China lacks the confidence to engage and prefers bilateral engagement to the risk that it be ganged up on or contained by other states that have more in common with one another than they do with China. And then it rises. China finds multilateralism more attractive as China gains in clout and in confidence and in a belief that it is strong enough, able enough, and not so disliked that it can gain something through engagement. And now we head into the current phase, the downward slope of the capital N, of decline, as a more powerful and more confident China feels it can do better asserting its clout without the fetters of multilateralism and going one-on-one against weaker states. But what does that mean over the horizon? Does the N curve go back up again, completing the letter, in that China becomes a regional hegemon and starts being willing to underwrite regional structures that serve its own interests, much as the U.S. did in hegemonic stability theory? Final point, and a little bit at odds with Gil here, perhaps. I want to suggest that a lot of what's going on here is a moment truly of significant uncertainty and ambivalence in China's engagement with the region and the wider world. It's rooted in a strange and potentially volatile brew of cockiness and insecurity. And that is some of what we may be seeing here. Since time's short, I'll just offer a quick pastiche of things that suggest this may be going on. There's a Beida professor at SIS, School of International Studies. I don't remember which one it is, so I can't drop the footnote, but who wrote an article describing China as an adolescent power. And since it's a self-description and I don't have to be a condescending American, I'll just quote it. That is, China is full of newfound strength and a belief that its elders are idiots, but it's not yet fully in control of its emotions, its behavior, or even its new gangly limbs. And it's occasionally prone to reckless behavior. And at some level, it's deeply unsure that it's able or willing to take on adult responsibilities. Not implausible. Secondly, it's striking how much, in the story Gil quite ably tells, that China has been willing to throw its soft power under the bus. There was a lot of energy put into that, and now there's a lot that's being done that undermines it. And that's a remarkable switch, and he's given you several examples. One can add the way it's handled the Rabia Kadir, Xinjiang types of stories, and the way it's handled Liu Xiaobo, as Gil mentioned. Another point in the same vein, I think there's a serious schizophrenia going on in China about whether China sees itself as weak or strong. And I think the history point is really on the China sees itself as weak side. The hard power point from Gil's paper is on China sees itself as strong. So you see many signs that China sees itself as a top dog, given the robust economic growth, the impressive weathering of the global financial crisis, the touting of the China model, the beating up on the flaws of Anglo-American capitalism and the mess we've caused, and rejecting Western-style democracy, not so much paranoically anymore, as attempt to change China, but backhandedly as in saying it doesn't work so well. And, of course, election seasons in the U.S. give that a little more credibility. Or China is saying it's still a developing country. It's facing daunting challenges of development and stability at home. It doesn't know how to deal with it, and it certainly, and this theme has come out more again recently, it certainly doesn't know what political system will work to sustain that. So you get Wen Jiabao floating the notion of some kind of democracy again. You get Li Rui and the party elders saying we've got a real problem here. That's one pair. Another pair is that China sees itself as a great power which deserves its place at the table, must be given its due. It's the full equal of the U.S. versus we're a weak power, we can't be expected to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and so on. And my final sub-point here is it's bound up not only with the schizophrenia or ambivalence about China's own self-assessment, it's deeply entangled with China's ambivalent assessment of the U.S. And there's a big debate going on now about, are we in decline or are we still the formidable power? I think that's being fought out in quite serious terms, and it's a matter of our capacity. It's also a matter of our will. Going on also is this debate about whether the U.S. and China have some fundamentally compatible interests in economics, non-traditional security, world stability, or whether there's a deep conflict here, and that the China threat theory is really something the U.S. believes, and that the U.S. is out to contain China. Again, I was just in Beijing, and one of the things that kept getting a lot of play is our campaign commercials, right, about how we need to push back against China, including from Pat Toomey, or about Pat Toomey, anyway, the candidate might say. But there's just, I think that ambivalence is really there, and hopefully some of it will pass, at least the TV commercials. But I've run over time, so let me just stop there.
Just want to commend Jacques, because he did literally get off the airplane last night from China. So the fact that he's here and the fact that he, gave such an energetic response, I think is very commendable. Bonnie Glaser.
Thank you very much, Jacques. You're a tough act to follow. I'd like to thank the organizers, FPRI and the Reserve Officers Association, for having me here today and giving me the opportunity to join this panel. Multilateralism in East Asia cannot be effective without constructive involvement and cooperation from China. Since the mid-1990s, China's main goals in participating in institution building in East Asia have been to assuage concerns in the region about China's rise and to promote regional economic development. As security issues loom ever larger in East Asia, Gil Rozman notes, China's intentions may evolve and will be tested. And I fully agree with Gil that China will not likely revert to the cautious approval of security multilateralism that it was leaning toward prior to 2008, though I might also agree with the longer term, as Jacques has raised, at the end where China becomes sort of the major hegemonic power and then shapes institution building. But we are, I think, far from that day. The recent fracas, certainly over the South China Sea, illustrates Beijing's continuing preference for bilateralism, in which it wields greater leverage and can prevent its neighbors from mounting a coordinated position to challenge China. Rozman assesses China's strategic thinking towards the six-party talks, East Asia trilateralism, and the East Asia Summit with, as he says, the objective of discerning the causes of Chinese responses, specifically in 2010. And of the three causes that he posits, energy security, hard power or muscle flexing against the U.S., and the revival of national identity, I agree that national identity is the most persuasive for now, but hard power is a close second. As Chinese Navy continues to develop anti-access and power projection capabilities, I expect hard power to become even more salient. China's deliberate challenge to U.S. surveillance ships operating in its exclusive economic zone to enforce its interpretation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and its warnings this year to not sail an aircraft carrier in the Yellow Sea suggests that China is testing the limits of its growing power and leverage. Rozman also examines the question of what China is seeking from the three multilateral organizations that he considers. And I think it is clear that while in the past China approached these organizations defensively, seeking to minimize any negative impact on Chinese interests, going forward, Beijing will be more proactive in trying to shape these institutions and their agendas. In July of 2009, Hu Jintao told the 11th Quinquennial Ambassadorial Conference that at the same time that China continues to uphold Deng Xiaoping's strategic guideline, Taoguangyanghui, which Jacques also mentioned, often translated as hide one's times and bide one's capabilities, but I think probably more correctly understood as keeping a low profile. But Hu said in addition to upholding Taoguangyanghui, China should also actively or jiji seek to yosuo zuowei or get something accomplished. Of the three institutions, the one in which China is likely to be the most proactive in the near term is the six-party talks, if they are resumed. For China, the six-party talks have been a means to buy time. The mechanism was created to head off a U.S. conventional attack on North Korea when the Chinese feared that such an attack was possible. The talks continue to be promoted by Beijing to keep the U.S. focused on dialogue and on diplomatic solutions, while ensuring that the pressure put on North Korea that could lead to instability is kept at a minimum. Today, virtually no one believes that the six-party talks can achieve the goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, if they ever did. But this, of course, was the reason that it was ostensibly created. Beijing has undertaken a deliberate strategy to increase North Korean dependence on China and enhance China's ability to influence developments on the peninsula. It is possible, as Gil posits, that China will seek to use the talks as a means to transform the regional security picture, especially to shift away from the U.S. alliance system as the guarantor of regional security. I would like to now turn to the broader question raised by the conference organizers of whether institutions in East Asia are adequate to respond to the most likely new security challenges. The most immediate regional security challenge is in the maritime realm. The South China Sea and the East China Sea and even the Yellow Sea have recently been sites of maritime confrontation. Thus far, no multilateral organization has taken on this issue. Most differences over territory and EEZs have been discussed bilaterally. In the case of China and ASEAN, an agreement was signed in 2002 in which all parties agreed to resolve their differences peacefully and negotiate a binding code of conduct, which has not come to pass. A multilateral agreement on operational safety at sea is urgently needed, but it seems unlikely that such an accord can be hammered out in existing multilateral institutions. APEC, which is not discussed in Gil's paper, was established to promote trade liberalization and is ill-suited to address security issues. Earlier this century, the Bush administration attempted to use APEC to promote regional cooperation on terrorism and on nuclear nonproliferation. Given that Taiwan is a member of APEC, which is a grouping of economies, not countries, that attempt was ill-fated. Beijing vehemently opposed Taiwan playing a role on regional security issues. The ASEAN Regional Forum has so far also not been up to the task of managing security challenges. In her speech in Honolulu just last week, Secretary of State Clinton portrayed the East Asia Summit as a forum for substantive engagement on pressing strategic and political issues, including, she mentioned, nuclear nonproliferation, maritime security, and climate change. The EAS, I agree with Gil, currently represents the greatest hope for effective multilateralism, although in its infancy, the EAS is far from playing that role today. And Gil colorfully describes the EAS as a facade of multilateralism that hides the reality of an organizational vacuum in the region. As he also notes, however, if the East Asia Summit is to gain credibility, it must become a venue for negotiations to narrow differences over serious conflicts. It remains to be seen whether the EAS will live up to these expectations. Should tensions reemerge in the Taiwan Strait, the EAS holds out little hope for mounting a regional response. It is more likely that the U.S. and Japan would handle such a conflict, since their interests are more directly at stake. A third possible source of conflict could occur if the power transition in North Korea does not proceed smoothly and produces significant instability that spills over the country's borders. As currently structured, the six-party talks are ill-equipped to cope with North Korean instability or, even worse, collapse. It makes sense for 5 of the parties, excluding North Korea, to sit down and discuss contingency plans for multilateral humanitarian operations and joint efforts by the 2 nuclear powers, the U.S. and China, to secure WMD facilities in North Korea, and perhaps also Russia. But so far, China has balked at the numerous overtures for such a conversation. Finally, the greatest long-term challenge to the region is peacefully integrating a rising China. And here, the EAS can play a constructive role. The United States' re-engagement with the region in terms of multilateral institutions through the EAS can be employed to counterbalance China's growing military might and diplomatic assertiveness, a role that a growing number of countries in Asia want the U.S. to play. Washington's involvement in the EAS may also assist in transforming ASEAN from a talk shop to a substance-based forum. Thank you.
Okay, before we open to questions from the audience, give Professor Rozman an opportunity to respond to his commentators.
Well, thank you both for very informed comments, and I will come up with a few thoughts rather than some kind of organized overview and response. The first thing, I agree that hard power is very is growing and could be more significant. I think a lot of the rhetoric, I concentrate more on rhetoric than behavior, and the rhetoric is indicative of the framework, the deeper worldview that's being expressed, and that leads me to emphasize the sinocentric element. It's possible, though, that we will eventually see behavior that is inconsistent with that, or that the hard power will drive and the sinocentric factor will be secondary. The second thing is on Japan and South Korea. It seems to me that the Chinese really got a good deal of what they could have ever hoped for. They got a deal on Goguryeo. If the argument was defensive, the Chinese were saying, okay, we are weak, we can't be confident, we've been humiliated, and we don't want to be further, we have further vulnerability. Then the South Koreans took Goguryeo off the stage. They hadn't brought it up in the first place, they thought. But when China said, well, it's really because you have territorial designs and you're pushing, the South Koreans took it off. And Hatoyama, I would say, really took revisionism off the stage. That wasn't anymore a part of the Japanese political agenda for the leadership. And yet, those did not change China's approach and its historical perspective. And they brought up Goguryeo again in a more intense fashion. And they are bringing up the Japanese historical perspective, even if the Japanese leadership is not pressing the revisionism. And so I think that's pretty important. Another example that I did not raise that hasn't come up is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Does this show that China really is supportive of multilateralism? And my answer is that was a way to manage Russia. China has gained leverage in the region. That Sino-Russian tensions over this organization have only intensified, and I don't see that the tough decisions that could lead to multilateralism are likely to come there, not only because of China, but also because of Russia's hesitance about real multilateralism. So I don't think that would be an example of seriousness about multilateralism, or it could be a model for other organizations. I agree that there's a lot of ambivalence in China about the United States. I think that in the academic community you see a lot of this, and so all of us looking at China are trying to weigh how much credit to give to the military leader officials who come out with very assertive statements that wouldn't be tolerated from sitting officers in the United States or Japan, as seen in both countries in recent days. Why are they so tolerated in China? Or looking at the academic debate and trying to get at really what is the core of that debate, who's pushing it, because it's not really an academic debate as we know it in other countries, since there's so much from top-down guidance. There's so much censorship. Certain things can be stated and certain themes get highlighted, and they say, okay, this is the way we want to push this issue, and then it gets pushed in that way. So I'm more doubtful about the insecurity aspect. I think the timing and the nature of the Chinese response suggest that insecurity is far secondary to pride and confidence as an issue that's driving things. And finally, I will respond to the point about 5 versus 1 in the six-party talks. All along, I think that was the test for China. North Korea was going to defy the expectations of the others, and all along, if China was serious about multilateralism, it would be prepared to shift towards closer cooperation with the other four, Russia being an uncertain case, but the others, and then put more pressure on North Korea. And so I think the failure, as Bonnie has brought out, of Chinese willingness to accept any kind of 5 versus 1 shows the limitations of what it's after. And I think even though there's often a duality in the way Chinese discuss issues, for instance, in recent years saying bilateral relations were never better with each of the great powers. They're having wonderful improvement. Cooperation is increasing over competition. That was the mantra, at least until the end of 2008. I think there was a real shift around that time. But when you look at how they were analyzing situations, even those years where they were using that mantra, you get a sense that they were criticizing U.S. hegemonism no less intensely than before, and it gave them the foundation for pushing a different approach now that the U.S. is trying to contain China, precisely at the time when the U.S. has done the least that's provocative to contain China, or that Japan is involved in this containment effort in a more intense fashion. And by rejecting these countries, and I always thought South Korea was the real litmus test. They had such a good opportunity because South Korea is so economically beholden to China now and has been so much in favor throughout most of the past decade of sort of a more balanced relationship in the region and establishing some kind of regional multilateralism. And for China to essentially diss South Korea, and now Japan and the United States, seems to me that shows the direction things are going. It's not really ambivalence, but maybe there will be some potential for reversal, particularly after some leadership reshuffling in China.
All right, we have a microphone here at the front, and so if you have questions, and I hope you do, because we have lots of time, we'd ask you to approach the microphone and deliver your question.
I'm Richard Bush from the Brookings Institution. Thank you for the presentation and the comments. There is an assumption running through the discussion that China, what we call China, is a single intelligence that is assessing its security environment in light of China's interests and ambitions and coming up with a strategy and action plan to that's appropriate for the situation and so on. And that process is not necessarily easy, and I suspect sometimes that's operating in China, but I wonder if the behavior we've seen in the last year to 18 months can be explained in other ways.
I think some of the discussants may do a better job on this. I'm confident they know this issue well. I would like to be able to get at these internal debates in China, but for the last 6 years they haven't given me a visa, and I can't go there annually and get these internal discussions that I so relied on in previous periods. But certainly there's some difference, and you see it in the politics with Wen Jiabao. But I don't have reason to think that is a major factor.
I agree with you, Richard, that there are different possible explanations and probably not mutually exclusive explanations. There may be more than one thing going on. One could posit that there is a split in the leadership, that there are different approaches by different people at the top. I myself think that's least likely. I think that there is a lot of convergence in the leadership on the priorities that they have and how to deal with the outside world. But there are some other possible explanations that I think I would point to. There are certainly many new constituencies or interest groups that are influencing the leadership. And Linda Jacobson has done a very nice piece on the new actors in Chinese foreign policy, and we did a discussion, an event that related to her recent report that you can find on our website at CSIS. I find that we need to pay more attention to some of these actors. The military is one. We've talked a little bit about that. Energy companies are another, and certainly public opinion, the most difficult to understand. How public opinion is actually influencing the leadership and how the leadership perceives the importance of public opinion and the risk that it poses for their own legitimacy. Another explanation that comes to mind, which I think is probably also relevant, is that there are very poor and inadequate institutions in China, lack of coordination, and an inability to respond effectively to particularly crises as they emerge. So those are just some of the things that I can think of, and I appreciate your question.
Yeah, just partly in response to Richard's question and partly in response to Gil's comment. I think there is not, I agree with Bonnie here, not a profound divide among the top leadership about where China needs to go or what the agenda is, and we're still in a period of, I think, remarkable consensus, and we're just sort of trimming around the edges in a foreign policy that still largely reflects domestic priorities. The idea is to find the way to shape the world or to buy and create the space in the world that China can pursue its domestic agenda, and there's not a profound strategic divide on that. There are, however, I think, tactical differences that can play out. And I would say in terms of the ambivalence I was referring to earlier, I'm not sure that the ambivalence about how to assess China's relative strength and relative internal stability, for that matter, points in different directions on foreign policy. I think the aggressiveness, the assertiveness can be tied either to a sense of insecurity or a sense of security. And I agree with Gil about the voices he's hearing, but I think they have been driving a lot of this, but from what I hear, there are a lot of people who are worried about those voices going much too far and not understanding the dangers of not tending to some of the weaknesses at home and that sort of thing. So it's really not a question of a different foreign policy agenda as a concern that if China looks for too much trouble abroad, it may create problems for some of for achievement of some of the other priorities. So just to give two examples that I've heard in recent discussions. One is this concern about public opinion, and particularly the concern that the leaders listen too much to the most audible form of public opinion in what is not a democratic system, and that tends to be pretty hardcore nationalists. And whether it is pretextual or genuinely believed, it becomes very powerful to say we got to worry about the street, which is profoundly assertive and anti-American and a bunch of other things. There's a little bit of disingenuity to that, but I think it has some traction. I think that's one piece. The other concern that I've heard a lot of recently is whether the confidence in the Chinese economic model, based on the post-Washington consensus, the problems here, runs a risk of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as one policy-connected scholar put it. That is, the concern that this guojinmintui, the sort of expansion of the state, contraction of the private sector, and the sort of failure to press forward with some more reforms in the domestic economy may ultimately not be terribly successful, and then you've obviously got a problem for foreign policy resources.
General Taylor?
Larry Taylor, retired Marine Corps. On the subject of rhetoric versus behavior and how it might relate to our military presence, U.S. military presence in the Western Pacific. In recent days, I've heard a few buzz phrases from U.S. Or read a few buzz phrases from U.S. officials. An unnamed official in an Australian paper the other day talked about our military presence needed to be more politically sustainable and geographically dispersed. And then the Secretary of State the other day talked about forward deployed diplomacy. When I hear phrases like that, I think we're pulling back. I'm wondering what the hard power folks in China think when they hear phrases like this.
I think you are far more prepared to discuss the implications of military rhetoric. I note that we've just heard today that Vietnam has decided to make Cam Ranh Bay accessible to foreign navies, including the United States and presumably India, and Russia's involved in the rebuilding of that. So I'm not sure if the point is that the United States may be a little bit more cautious about operating in the Yellow Sea or right next to China's border and emphasize more actions at some distance, I'm not sure that isn't a reasonable response to some changes in military behavior, but I don't think there'll be any signal that the U.S. is pulling back.
I would just comment that from China's perspective, I think it's really just the opposite. I think the Chinese look at the United States and see us pulling out of Iraq, and they expect soon out of Afghanistan, turning our attention and our resources to East Asia with a vengeance. And of course, the United States has said since very early, we are returning to Asia, particularly to Southeast Asia. And I think the fact that the United States hasn't sailed to, the George Washington, the Yellow Sea is just, not yet. I myself wish that we had not allowed such a long period of time to elapse after the sinking of the Chonan before we did that, and we can dispute whether or not it was the right reason to delay it, but I think we all know that end of this year, early next year, and they're now saying after probably Hu Jintao's visit, that we will see that. And I think that the Chinese look around their periphery, they particularly Secretary Clinton's speech in Hanoi and our involvement with Vietnam and the emphasis that this administration is paying to East Asia, the number of trips, the number of meetings, President Obama's visit to New York with the U.S. ASEAN summit, and virtually all the bilats with Asian leaders. I think that they see just the opposite trend.
I'd just say quickly that I think that many of the issues that China has put on the table in the maritime areas are ones where the U.S. won't back down because it can't. I mean, they're just huge issues at stake. If you were to accept the Chinese position on the EEZ, if you were to accept the Chinese position on territorial waters and islands, I mean, that just has huge implications that I think would be strategically unacceptable. And I think the Chinese very, very much took notice of Hillary Clinton's Hanoi speech. I mean, that's received a huge amount of attention.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. On this issue of various factions, I thought that Linda Jacobson made an interesting point the other morning in response to my question about when the heads of state had intervened in order to calm the waters. And Linda's point was when it began to get out of control. And she was particularly referring to the South China Sea issue, and I think to the harassment of the USNS Impeccable. There are probably some others I could bring to mind. But anyway, she was asserting that President Hu Jintao was not letting things that would truly disrupt the relationship profoundly get out of hand, at least to the degree that he could skillfully do such a thing. One thought on that. I just came back from China. I sort of tried that on people, though I was not there to talk about these issues. I sort of put words in their mouths to say, for example, the one I just brought up, did President Hu Jintao say, knock it off, we're getting ready for the summit. So it's time for us to ease back on pressure on Taiwan and so forth. Well, I couldn't get anybody to repeat those words, but I also did not have anyone to say either directly to me or privately afterwards, you're full of beans. I did have quite a number of people to come up and say, I agree with you, you're right on target. So I think there's something to say for looking at the relationship that way. My point being that there is the prospect that for the summit and afterwards, that we can hope that at least there are, in the most senior leadership positions, some people who value the U.S.-China relationship to the degree that they will weigh whether these things should be allowed to be truly disruptive forces. I don't know if I'm naive or not. I toss it out for you to comment on.
Want to take a swing at that?
Well, I think that makes sense. I mean, when they have a summit, they prepare for it, and they want to create the right climate. I think we can see the parallel with Japan when the relations deteriorated through 2006. The Chinese said, well, how can we put things back on some positive course? So we can expect these kinds of ups and downs in the future. I don't see any basic directional change because of the summit. After all, there certainly wasn't that when Obama went to China in the fall of 2009. That seems to have corresponded really to the deterioration that followed. So I don't have any particular reason to think that this summit will be a turning point, but I do think we can expect the next few months to be quieter.
Gil, I'm hypothesizing some sort of limit. I'm not arguing that it's definitely there, but saying, might we be seeing it?
I don't think China wants direct confrontation at this point, so I wouldn't be surprised if there will be limits like that, yes.
I think that generally makes sense, and it's consistent with a lot of what we know about Chinese elite political behavior in general. There's lots that goes on within bounds, but those bounds get set. On the summit issue, I had a Chinese colleague waggishly suggest to me last week that the U.S. should ask for everything it wants now because the Chinese desperately want the summit to go well. That's more than a little overstated, but they do create opportunities, obviously, for trying to build some, if not build some foundations, at least to repair some recent dents and dings.
Well, I think that the Chinese are fundamentally unhappy that the U.S.-China relationship has deteriorated to the extent that it has. They don't see it as in their interest, and they certainly don't want a confrontation with the United States. I think that China feels that the United States is to blame for much of what is going on. And yes, a leaders' meeting is a good opportunity to try to put things back together, but we did try to do that at the nuclear summit last April, where we sent Deputy Secretary Steinberg and Jeff Bader to Beijing after China reacted harshly to the announcement of the arms sale to Taiwan and the president's meeting with the Dalai Lama. And I think the Chinese really thought that they had put everything back together. And then things deteriorated rather sharply. And I think the Chinese almost uniformly, to the extent that we can say that there is one view in China, really would blame the United States, although there are many people in China who do privately say that China hasn't handled some of these things very well. But the fact that Secretary Clinton gave the speech that she did, for example, in Hanoi, is really, I think, seen as quite an example of U.S. assertiveness as we talk about Chinese assertiveness. So I think that the summit coming up is very important. The Chinese have signaled us in all sorts of ways through our officials that they want to have a very successful summit. Obviously, we do too. We are, Jacques, seeking to extract everything we can out of China for this summit, including a commitment to have Secretary Gates visit China shortly thereafter, which I think the Chinese, have been very ambivalent about accepting, but now are going to go forward with. I myself am not terribly optimistic about what will happen after this summit, because I think that there are increasingly sharp differences and diverging interests.
Yes, ma'am. First and then second.
Hi, Lisa Hopkins from the Army Directed Studies Office. I would like to ask a question about Southeast Asia. You all mentioned it a little bit. We've talked about ASEAN plus 8 just being created, East Asian Summit, as possible forums for security cooperation or security issues that need to be dealt with. But we've focused mostly on those that exist in Northeast Asia. Does China have significant security interests that may overlap or may contrast with U.S. ones in Southeast Asia? And do you see any of these forums as a place that those could be worked out? Thank you.
It certainly has security interests in Southeast Asia, and the South China Sea has been seen as a test for among some of the Southeast Asian countries. And I think China will be reluctant to have the East Asian Summit become the place to deal with some of these issues, prefers a bilateral approach. So that'll be one of the tests. And I think a lot of it depends on to what extent ASEAN can agree on security agendas. And right now that seems to me to be fairly doubtful, because China, it takes agreement among 10 countries, and that's not an easy thing to do, and they have such diverse ties to the United States and to China.
On the question of what the United States and China, what our converging interests are in the South China Sea, I would say having open slocks, for example, maintaining access to the region. I don't think that the Chinese really have an interest in trying to exclude the United States or other countries from the region. But when it comes to the territorial disputes, the other resources, energy, fishery resources. I mean, these are clearly important priorities for China, and China would like to maintain access and maintain control over some of these areas, particularly in terms of where it defines its exclusive economic zones. As some people think that China really claims the entire South China Sea as its own territory. It depends, I think, who you talk to. That is not China's official position. But at a minimum, it would be the sea claims that extend from the land features, which then would have their own EEZs, and China would want to exclude other countries from operating their military in those regions, which is where we would have differences, but it would still have the right to have exclusive commercial access.
Jacques?
Not much to add to that, except that I think that in those areas we have a couple of issues which perennially become the focus of poking sticks at one another. And so the recent dust-up over the core interest, the He and the Yi thing, I mean, that's really become quite a sore point with the Chinese. They at least claim to have been somewhat taken aback by the strength of the U.S. reaction to the claim that this was a core interest. They said, we've always claimed it's our territory. Of course, territory is a core interest. What are you all bent out of shape about? It was just a passing comment by Dai Bingguo, and the U.S. obviously read it as something warranting the kind of pushback we gave. And there's a perennial source of almost status and stature things going on with the Seventh Fleet's role in providing the public goods of the sea lanes of communication. I mean, I don't think China wants to challenge that fundamentally, but clearly it's a rhetorical sticking point that you get this question of the double standard. Why does the U.S. get to do that? Why is it that our treating it as our lake? Now, I think those things are not immediate or significant sources of real conflicts or divergences of interest, but they do become debating points that cause tensions.
Yes, sir.
My name is Stein Tønneson. I'm normally at the Peace Research Institute Oslo, but presently at the United States Institute of Peace. I've seen an interesting change in the discussion, because in the first comments to Gilbert Rozman's paper, the focus was on the relationship between hard power and on ideas, sinocentrism. And in a way, the first of the three explanations that Gilbert Rozman mentioned, which had to do with economic interests and sea lanes and all these things that are driven from China's economic interests, were not so much emphasized. Now we've had a change more from seeing Chinese assertiveness to seeing U.S. assertiveness. So I wonder about this soundbite that Jacques deLisle quoted from Gilbert Rozman about moving from an economic-driven foreign policy to a security in command. What is the reason for that? Is it China that drives this, or is it the U.S.? In a way, the only reason I could see why China would want to do this would be if its economy failed, because Chinese economy is in such an enormous challenge at the moment. They have put in a colossal stimulus package. There is an article by Elizabeth Economy in the most recent issue of Foreign Affairs that shows how China now depends on a kind of reforms that would be on the same stature as those driven by Deng Xiaoping in his time, because now they need to move from this very strongly investments and savings-driven phase to a phase with innovation, and where they can no longer perhaps as much rely on the American economy as before. So I would say that when the Central Committee of the Communist Party just met, the main emphasis they had was on the internal domestic economics agenda still, but one of the big Chinese concerns is that they can no longer rely so much on the United States, both because of the weaker state of the American market, the American economy, and because of possible American trade policies that are more turned towards protectionism. And that I would really try to ask the panel to address this first of Gilbert Rozman's explanations and tell me why you don't think that will continue to count in Chinese foreign policy. Thank you.
I don't think there's any doubt that China continues to seek economic integration in Asia. And it's pushing for a free trade agreement in the trilateralism. It wants to carry forward the ASEAN-China trade agreement. It's looking for more opportunities of that sort. But when I made the argument that we've moved from economics in command with regard to the search for multilateralism, I argued that China is now interpreting the regional organization efforts less with regard to what it can gain economically, because it has gained a lot and still expects to, but more in terms of what is happening on the security front, because that I agree that in some sense the United States has driven the security agenda for some time. North Korea has put security more in the forefront for other countries in Northeast Asia. China has put in the forefront in the South China Sea. Japan and South Korea are thinking in China much more in security terms. And China has done things to create that image. So it had, for a while, tried to bypass the security issues by emphasizing such as trilateralism, but it always had understood there was an element of other dimensions that had to go with this. So it was aware that there was a discussion of an East Asian community. How do we increase trust? How do we make sure that the history issues don't come back and haunt agreements? So it's understood that economics doesn't operate alone, but what's happened in the whole climate of the region is that economics has taken on a different perspective. And I would say a lot of it is due to the Chinese rhetoric of emphasizing U.S. hegemonism and U.S. Cold War mentality and other factors that bring security to the forefront.
As Gil said, his hypothesis was that economics was in the past the centerpiece of China's approach to multilateralism, and that would be moving more towards security. So I don't think he was arguing that economics has declined in Chinese foreign policy. But even as I would agree that the internal situation, and particularly economic development, remains the priority, I think that China has put security at a higher place in its policy than it has before. Some of it is reactive, but I prefer to think of it as really more interactive, that there are different, that both parties, particularly the United States and China, are acting and reacting to each other. And you could take, for example, the issue, again, that I mentioned earlier about China's objection to the sailing of an aircraft carrier in the Yellow Sea, where there was no decision made by the United States to actually sail the carrier, no announcement that it was going to, but the Chinese came out and told us officially at the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman that we should not do so. Again, putting security really front and center in a way that I think was very much not in China's interests. I would say China's reaction to the Chonan also put security front and center. So I think that security is becoming more important in Chinese foreign policy. It is in part a reaction in some way to the United States and also other countries in the region that have security concerns. And of course, China's own military buildup, even if you want to portray it as primarily defensive and focused on an anti-access strategy, which I would argue is only one piece of it, still argues in favor of attaching greater attention to security.
I think that's all right. I'd only point to some of what underlies it, which is, China's economic engagement is in a sense an old story. It's been going on a long time. It's been very successful. And China has, as Gil explains in his paper, reaped a lot of the benefits to be reaped from that. So in some sense, it's not at all surprising there's been at least a relative shift towards security issues. And through the interactive process that Bonnie describes, underlying that, of course, is the recent vector has been China's rising power. and rising assertion of its security interests, relative to a baseline which was all about economics and engaging and making for a happy environment. So it's not that economics have been thrown to the side, it's just that there's now something else competing for space, as it were.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm Siwan Bian with the Asia Foundation. Following up on the discussion on implications for U.S.-China relations, one effect of the tensions between China and its neighbors, including Japan, South Korea, and Southeast Asia, as Professor Rozman mentioned, was to widen or reveal basic strategic differences between the U.S. and China. And although regional powers see the rise of China and its implication on regional security negatively, at the same time, especially U.S. allies see a stable U.S.-China relationship as important for their long-term strategic interests. So my question is, what do you see as some of the major areas of U.S.-China conflict that would be particularly worrisome for Chinese neighbors, including U.S. allies, based on the trend of regional dynamics that you describe? Do you see a return to simple emergence of big power politics between U.S. and China focused on traditional security issues? Thank you.
I think we're still facing an environment where there are two huge issues. Taiwan, which we've barely discussed and which seems to be off the table because it looks like there's this cooperative atmosphere, but ultimately I think much of what's going on in China's thinking relates to impatience over what's going to happen in Taiwan in the coming years. So I think the conflicts over Taiwan are big. And then North Korea. It seems North Korea being an actor that can set some of the agenda and then how to react. And I really regard the strategic goals of China as coming much more into the open in the last couple of years towards North Korea. And that there was much talk for a long time that China's real concern was refugees pouring over the border or United States attacking North Korea. And I think more and more we recognize that what China wants to do is shape the transformation of the Korean Peninsula and the regional security system. And that creates the potential for severe problems, particularly if North Korea repeats behaviors such as seen in the Chonan incident. So I think we do have the potential for hard power conflict. That builds on what's been happening, and that's why we should be particularly concerned about these incidences. I also think we now have more concern over the Senkaku Diaoyu issue. That issue is now, China is continuing to indicate that it will do things to change the status quo that existed. It has to establish some territorial presence in order to make its case for why its territorial claim is just. And so I don't think that issue is off the table. I think we will see more instances of the sort we saw in September, and that may be the third case where real confrontation is possible.
The countries in the region, I think, are, even as they are nervous about some of the negative implications of China's rise and some of China's behavior recently, particularly in the South China Sea for those countries who are in Southeast Asia, and then in the East China Sea for Japan. I think those countries at the same time have made it clear that they want to have a good relationship with China. Yes, they want a more present, more active United States. They would like to see greater U.S. leadership, but they don't want this to be aimed at in any way at containing China. All these countries have tremendous interests at stake with China, and not just economic interests. So I think that more broadly, what most of the countries are concerned about is a zero-sum competition. between the United States and China, in which they are in a position where they are forced to choose, and no country really wants to do that. Gil has already pointed out, I think, some of those issues that could cause such a sharp divide. Certainly, developments on the Korean Peninsula are one. I would say Taiwan is on the back burner, not off the table. It will inevitably come back in the form of a U.S. arms sale to Taiwan in the near term, and potentially something else in the longer term. Conflict in China's EEZ as a function of its different position that it holds relative to the U.S. and most other countries, or some unexpected conflict in the maritime domain or in the airspace in the region. And I would say that if we look at some of the history of the U.S.-China relationship, often it is what is unexpected that does occur in the relationship, particularly if it develops into a crisis that then spills over into a political crisis. If you have if it is related to, it involves the death of a Chinese pilot, as it did in 2001. Or the incident that took place in 2009 in China's EEZs. These things then then fan the flames of nationalism and become far more difficult to handle, and then become more of a political crisis. And I think that is quite worrisome to the region as well.
Again, I'd agree with my panel colleagues on this. I think they've gone through the inventory. The things that are most likely to roil the waters are all those gifts that keep on giving. I mean, the North Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits issue, the Senkaku Diaoyu, and to a lesser degree, perhaps recently, although again, possibly out there, the South China Sea. And overlapping with all that, Bonnie's point about the sort of disputes about how close the U.S. can operate to Chinese shores without running afoul of Chinese views of what goes on there. I think anything else beyond that is pretty far down the list, but let me suggest that the other thing that might be looming out there is a lower probability, is if we see China start to use its considerable economic leverage to political ends more. And the rare earth fandango is perhaps a blip of that possibility, and I think then you wind up having some significant spillover effects.
I'd like to thank Professor Rozman for his paper, and to the panelists for their responses, and I think stimulated a great deal of discussion and got the conference off to a good start. And of course, I like being a moderator. My job can be easy or difficult, and they made it very easy because we're right on time. So thank you very much. We have 15 minutes coffee and snacks out there in the lobby, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes at 1:45. Yeah, how are you? Good to see you.